Before my daughter's wedding, I went to a suit shop for a fitting. The owner pushed me into a fitting room and whispered, "There are things you need to know. Stay here. Do not say a word. Trust me." I was confused, but I stayed. Minutes later, what I heard through the wall left me frozen in place. "My name is William Stanton. I am 70 years old, and I am telling you this because you never truly know the people sitting at your dinner table." I spent 4 decades building a shipping empire from a single rusty freighter on the Great Lakes into a $50 million fleet. Every gray hair on my head, every late night spent away from home was a sacrifice made for my family. I thought my wealth was an impenetrable shield that would protect my only daughter Audrey long after I was gone, especially after losing my beloved wife Martha 5 years ago. Audrey was my entire world, and I was about to hand her over to a monster. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your intelligence. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky over Chicago was a heavy, bruised gray, threatening rain. I had driven myself to Miriam's bespoke tailoring in the Gold Coast district. Miriam had been making my suits for over 20 years. She crafted the tuxedo I wore to my 25th anniversary with Martha, and she was currently tailoring the one I would wear to walk Audrey down the aisle. The grand wedding was only days away. The groom was Preston Reed. He was a 32-year-old investment fund manager, smooth, articulate, and impeccably dressed. He seemed like the absolute perfect match for my precious girl. I parked my car and walked into the shop. The familiar scent of wool chalk dust and expensive leather usually brought me a sense of peace. But the moment the little brass bell above the door chimed, I noticed something was terribly wrong. Miriam was standing behind the counter. She was as pale as a ghost. The color had completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking fragile and terrified. Her hands were shaking so violently that she dropped a heavy pair of fabric shears onto the wooden floor. She looked at me, then darted her eyes toward the back hallway of her shop in sheer panic. She rushed around the counter, grabbed my arm with a grip that bruised my skin, and dragged me toward the rear storage rooms. I tried to ask her what was going on, but she clamped a trembling hand over my mouth. Her eyes were wide with pure terror. She shoved me into a narrow, dark closet filled with heavy rolls of fabric and old garment bags. "Mr. Stanton, there are things you need to know," she whispered, her voice barely catching her breath. "Stay in here. Do not make a sound. Do not say a single word. Trust me." Before I could process the absurdity of the situation or offer a protest, she pulled the door shut, and the lock clicked from the outside. I was plunged into total darkness. The smell of mothballs and damp wool suffocated me. My knees ached from standing awkwardly in the cramped space. My heart hammered against my ribs. I am a 70-year-old man. I have negotiated with ruthless labor unions and survived cutthroat corporate raids. I am not used to being shoved into closets like a disobedient child. My initial reaction was pure indignation. I reached for the brass door handle, fully ready to demand an immediate explanation. Then I heard the voices. They came clearly through the thin drywall, separating my closet from the VIP fitting room right next door. The walls in these old Chicago buildings are notoriously thin, offering no privacy. I recognized the first voice immediately. It was Preston, my future son-in-law, the man who had sat at my dinner table just 2 nights prior, asking for my blessing and promising to protect my daughter forever. The second voice belonged to Valerie. Valerie was Audrey's maid of honor and supposedly her best friend since college. They were supposed to be across town picking up the final alterations for the bridesmaids' dresses. But they were not talking about chiffon or floral arrangements or wedding logistics. "Did he sign the trust merger document yet?" Valerie asked. Her voice lacked the bubbly, high-pitched enthusiasm she always used around Audrey. It was flat, cold, incredibly calculating. "He will do it tomorrow morning," Preston replied. His tone sent a violent shiver down my spine. It was entirely devoid of the charming warmth he used to win over my board of directors. The old man trusts me implicitly, I told him it was a vital tax shield to protect Audrey's inheritance from corporate capital gains taxes. He ate it right up. He actually thinks I am securing his precious shipping fleet. I stood frozen in the dark. The trust merger. Preston had brought it to my attention a month ago during a private dinner at my estate. He poured me a glass of aged scotch and presented it as a brilliant financial maneuver to consolidate my $50 million empire and safeguard it for Audrey. I had the paperwork sitting on my mahogany desk at home, waiting for my signature. "Make sure he signs it before the ceremony," Valerie said, followed by a soft, mocking laugh. "Because once the ink is dry, I can initiate the asset liquidation through our offshore accounts. We can bleed the entire Stanton fleet dry in less than 72 hours. $50 million, Preston. I cannot believe you actually pulled this off." "I am not done yet," Preston murmured. I could hear the rustle of expensive clothing through the wall. "I need to make sure the transition of power is entirely natural. No police investigations. No detectives asking questions about where the old man went." "You got the beta blockers?" Valerie asked. "Right here," Preston said. "I have been crushing them into a fine powder for weeks. Tomorrow morning, when I bring him his traditional pre-wedding black coffee, I will slip the dose in. He already has a slight heart arrhythmia. The medical records show it clearly. A heavy dose of this compound will induce a massive catastrophic myocardial infarction. By the time the wedding reception is over, his heart will simply give out. It will look like the stress and emotion of the day were just too much for his aging body." My blood ran completely cold. I literally forgot how to breathe. The darkness of the closet seemed to press in on me, crushing my chest. I pressed my trembling hands against the wall to keep my balance. My son-in-law was not just a corporate thief. He was planning my murder. He had researched my medical history. He had procured lethal medication. He was going to stop my heart steal my life's work and leave my daughter a grieving, helpless widow under his complete financial and psychological control. And Valerie, Audrey's best friend, she was fully in on it. They were orchestrating the total destruction of my family from inside a bridal shop. I will be the grieving son-in-law. Preston continued, a sick smile evident in his voice. Audrey will be devastated. She will lean on me for absolutely everything. She will sign over whatever is left without even reading it. We will mourn the great William Stanton. We will give him a beautiful, expensive funeral. And then we will be gone with the money. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful, it wiped away every ache in my 70-year-old joints. A primal protective rage boiled in my chest. I wanted to smash through the drywall. I wanted to wrap my hands around Preston's neck and choke the life out of him. I wanted to protect my daughter at all costs. But a cold, calculating instinct took over. The exact instinct that had helped me build an empire from absolutely nothing. If I confronted them right now, it would be my word against theirs. They would deny it entirely. They would say I misunderstood a conversation about a movie or a book. They would convince Audrey I was losing my mind, that my age was catching up with me and making me paranoid. They would accelerate their plans to kill me. I needed solid proof. I needed a flawless strategy. I needed to let them think they were winning. I took a slow, silent breath through my nose, trying desperately to calm the violent trembling in my hands. I stepped back from the wall, planning to wait in the dark until they left the shop. But the floorboards beneath my feet betrayed me. A loud, sharp creak echoed loudly through the silent closet. The voices in the next room stopped instantly. A dead, heavy silence hung in the air. "Did you hear that?" Preston asked. His voice was sharp, alert, and suddenly much closer to the wall. "It came from the storage closet," Valerie whispered. I stood completely paralyzed. I held my breath, clenching my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. Heavy footsteps approached the other side of my door. The brass doorknob rattled violently as someone tried to twist it open. It was locked from the outside, but the aged wood groaned under the immense pressure. Miriam Preston called out, his voice echoing just inches away from my face. "Is someone in there?" The brass doorknob rattled again, more violently this time. I held my breath, pressing my back flat against the cold plaster wall of the storage closet. My heart was pounding so forcefully against my ribs, I was certain they could hear it through the solid wood. The sharp, demanding bark echoed in the tiny space, making my chest tighten further. I knew I had to move right now or face the devastating consequences. Miriam Preston's voice was no longer the charming, cultured tone he used at my dinner table. It was a sharp, demanding bark. "Open this door." "I cannot find the key, Mr. Preston." Miriam stammered. Her voice trembled, but she was trying her best to buy me time. "It is just old inventory in there. Dusty fabrics. Nothing you need to see. Please, your fitting is ready in the front room." I heard a floorboard squeak, Preston insisted. A heavy thud shook the door frame. He was kicking it. "I want to see what is inside." I looked around the pitch-black space. A sliver of gray light filtered in from a high, narrow window near the ceiling, illuminating a heavy fire door at the back of the closet, an emergency exit leading to the alleyway. I moved with deliberate slowness, carefully placing my feet to avoid loose boards navigating through hanging garment bags that smelled of cedar. Another heavy kick struck the closet door. The wood splintered. I reached the heavy steel push bar of the fire door. If it shrieked when I opened it, I was dead. I pressed my weight against it steadily, avoiding a sudden jolt. The latch gave way with a soft, metallic click. I slipped out into the damp, freezing air of the Chicago alleyway just as I heard the interior closet door completely give way behind me, crashing into the wall. "There is no one here," Valerie said, her voice echoing into the space I had just vacated. "You are being paranoid, Preston." The wind probably rattled the shutters. I gently pulled the heavy steel door shut until it clicked securely. I stood alone among the dumpsters, the freezing rain misting against my face. The illusion of my peaceful retirement was shattered. I walked down the alley, my mind racing. I gripped the steering wheel of my sedan until my knuckles turned completely white. For 40 years, I navigated the treacherous waters of international shipping. I dealt with extortionists and ruthless competitors. But nothing had prepared me for the sheer malice of the man sleeping under my roof. The man who smiled at my jokes. The drive back gave me time to build a fortress around my emotions. I could not just throw him out. Preston had established his perfect facade, and Audrey was infatuated. If I accused him of plotting my murder without evidence, he would turn her against me. He would play the victim, convincing my only child that grief and age had finally broken my sanity. No. I had to sit at the table with the devil and pretend I did not see his horns today. That evening, the dining room of my estate felt like a mausoleum. The grand mahogany table where Martha and I used to host joyous holiday feasts now hosted a macabre charade. Our housekeeper had prepared roasted lamb and asparagus. The crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier. Audrey sat to my right, her eyes bright with the innocent exhaustion of wedding planning. Preston sat directly across from me. He wore a crisp navy button-down shirt, the very picture of a successful, reliable partner. The caterers finally confirmed the menu for the reception, Audrey said, taking a sip of her sparkling water. "And Miriam called to say your tuxedo will be delivered directly to the estate tomorrow morning, Dad. She said you left in a bit of a hurry today." I looked at Preston. He was cutting his meat, his expression perfectly serene, but I noticed the slight pause in his knife stroke. He was listening. I received an urgent call from the harbor master. I lied smoothly, picking up my wine glass. A union dispute over at the docks. I had to step out to handle it over the phone. But the fitting went well enough before that. "You work too hard," William Preston said, looking up with a smile so warm and genuine it made me physically nauseous. "You are supposed to be stepping back. You promised Audrey you would relax after the wedding." "I intend to," I replied, holding his gaze. "Which actually brings me to a bit of business. I was reviewing some emails from my legal team this afternoon. They mentioned the trust merger document you brought up last month, the one regarding the consolidation of the fleet's assets." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Audrey looked between us, slightly confused by the sudden shift to corporate talk. Preston did not miss a beat. He set his fork down, wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, and reached over to gently cover Audrey's hand with his own. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. "Ah, yes," Preston said, his voice dripping with respectful concern. "I reached out to your attorneys to get the draft finalized. I hope I did not overstep, William. I just wanted to make sure everything was in place before the honeymoon." "What is a trust merger?" Audrey asked, looking at Preston with complete trust. "It is a protective measure," sweetheart Preston explained, looking at my daughter as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Your father's shipping company has a massive valuation. If anything were to happen, the federal government would gut the estate with capital gains and inheritance taxes. By merging the assets into a singular protected trust, now we create a tax shield. It ensures that everything your father built stays entirely in the family. It protects you." He turned his eyes back to me, wearing a mask of absolute sincerity. "I know it is complex legal maneuvering, William, but I simply want to safeguard Audrey's future. The market is volatile. I want to make sure your legacy is bulletproof." "I appreciate your diligence, Preston," I said, forcing a polite nod. "It sounds very thorough." "Let Preston handle these things, Dad." Audrey chimed in, squeezing his hand. "He knows what he is doing. You always said you wanted someone to help manage the heavy lifting, so you could finally enjoy your retirement. He is just trying to take the burden off your shoulders." "He certainly is," I replied. Every word tasted like ash. I was looking at a man who had already planned my funeral, and my daughter was thanking him for it. "Let us not talk about taxes and trusts at the dinner table." Preston laughed, breaking the tension. "It is a time to celebrate. In fact, I asked the chef to prepare that apple tart you love so much, William. Let me go to the kitchen and grab it." Preston stood up from his chair. As he smoothed the front of his trousers, the fabric of his tailored jacket shifted. Something metallic and glass clinked against the solid wood of his chair. A small, unmarked amber vial slipped from his interior pocket and rolled silently onto the thick Persian rug beneath the table. The tiny amber vial spun across the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, stopping inches from my polished leather shoes. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. My eyes locked onto the small glass cylinder. There was no label, no prescription marking, just a heavy liquid inside. Preston froze for a fraction of a second. It was the only crack in his armor I had ever witnessed. But before I could reach down or even open my mouth, he smoothly leaned over his arm, sweeping the vial off the floor with practiced grace. He slipped it back into his tailored jacket, letting out a soft, very unassuming laugh. "My apologies." "William," he said, his voice entirely devoid of panic. "My allergy medication. The pollen counts in the city have been absolutely brutal this week, and I want to ensure my voice is clear for the vows on Saturday." I nodded slowly, forcing my facial muscles to remain relaxed. "Of course, Preston. We certainly cannot ever have the groom losing his voice." Audrey smiled affectionately at him, completely oblivious to the fact that the man beside her had just dropped the weapon he intended to use to stop my heart. He returned with the apple tart, serving us with charm. The tension in the room had simply gone underground, hiding beneath the polite clinking of silverware. Preston took a bite of dessert and steered the conversation back to the document on my desk. "William, regarding the trust merger, we should finalize the signatures by tomorrow morning. If we delay until after the honeymoon, we risk exposing the shipping fleet liquid assets to the new quarterly capital gains assessments." I set my fork down. "I have managed this company for 40 years, Preston. I am quite familiar with our tax liabilities. Rushing a $50 million consolidation to avoid an assessment seems extreme. A slight delay will not bankrupt us." Preston leaned forward with earnest concern. "It is not just about taxes, William. It is about establishing an irrevocable tax shield. If anything unpredictable were to happen to you, the government would tie up the estate in probate. Audrey would navigate a legal nightmare. The merger wraps your assets into a singular vault. I only want to ensure she is protected from predatory taxation." Audrey placed her hand over his. "You are so thoughtful, Preston," she murmured. She turned her gaze to me, the warmth vanishing into a defensive glare. Dad, why are you being so difficult? Preston has spent weeks coordinating with advisors to save our family millions. You should be thanking him. I looked at the daughter I had raised alone. I saw the conviction in her posture. Sweetheart, I said gently, I am simply exercising standard corporate diligence. A merger of this magnitude requires a thorough review. I cannot sign over my entire work without properly vetting the fine print. Audrey sighed very loudly. Dad, this is exactly what you always do. You question absolutely everyone. You trust absolutely no one. You have spent your entire life treating every business partner like a potential enemy, and now you are doing it to my future husband. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I am not treating him like an enemy, Audrey. I am treating him like a businessman. Well, he is not just a businessman, she snapped. He is family. He is the man I am marrying in 3 days. Do you know how many nights he has stayed up reviewing your corporate tax structures? He is doing this to protect us. I looked at Preston. He watched the exchange with polite discomfort, playing the peacemaker. William, please, Preston said softly. If you need more time, we can delay the filing. I never meant to cause a rift between you and Audrey. I only wanted to ease your burden so you could enjoy your retirement. Stop apologizing, Preston, Audrey interrupted. She glared at me. It is incredibly insulting, Dad. You complain about being tired, about wanting to step back. But the moment someone helps you, you treat them with suspicion. You are being paranoid. I sat in silence. Preston had methodically isolated me from the only family I had left. He had positioned himself as her ultimate protector. In her eyes, he was absolutely flawless. If I told her right now that her partner and her maid of honor were plotting to murder me, she would not believe a single syllable. She would think I had finally lost my grip on reality. I was entirely alone. You are right, I said quietly. I lowered my gaze, playing the part of the stubborn old man, realizing his folly. I apologize. I am accustomed to handling everything myself. It is difficult to let go of the reins. Preston, I appreciate your work. I will review the documents tonight and handle the signatures in the morning. The beautiful face of Audrey softened. Thank you, Dad. I know change is hard, but Preston really does have our best interests at heart. You will see. Preston smiled, picking up his wineglass. To family, he said smoothly. To family, I echoed, raising my water glass, masking the absolute fury burning in my veins. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation. I retreated to my study shortly after dinner, feigning exhaustion. I locked the oak door behind me and sank into my chair. My mind raced through different scenarios. I needed to act. Morning dawned very bright. I barely slept, spending the night pacing my bedroom, formulating a strategy. At precisely 7 in the morning, there was a gentle knock on my door. I opened it to find Preston standing in the hallway. He held a steaming ceramic mug in his hand. He smiled brightly, looking energetic and ready to conquer the day. Good morning, William, he said, warmly extending the mug. I know you start your day early. I brewed your favorite dark roast. Black, exactly how you prefer it. I figured you might need a little extra energy to go over the final details for the wedding. I looked at the dark liquid, the beta blockers, the lethal dose he had described in the fitting room. He was handing me my death sentence with a perfectly pleasant smile. Thank you, Preston, I said, taking the warm ceramic mug from his hands. That is incredibly thoughtful of you. I appreciate it. Take your time getting ready, he added smoothly. I will be down in the home office whenever you are ready to review the paperwork. I nodded, offering him a perfectly convincing, grateful smile. I gently closed the heavy bedroom door and quietly locked it. I stood completely still in the center of the room, staring intensely down at the dark, steaming liquid. My aged heart pounded a frantic warning rhythm against my ribs. I slowly raised the warm porcelain rim of the mug to my dry lips. I absolutely did not swallow, but I carefully let a single tiny drop of the hot coffee touch my tongue. Instantly buried beneath the robust, familiar flavor of the roasted beans, I detected a distinctly sharp, faint, metallic bitterness. I kept my expression neutral, offering Preston a grateful nod as he turned to leave the room. The moment the oak door clicked shut, my body went rigid. I did not swallow. I held the toxic liquid in the back of my mouth, the metallic taste burning my tongue. Moving with silent urgency, I rushed to the adjoining master bathroom. I grabbed a sterilized travel flask from my toiletry bag and carefully spat the contents into it. I sealed the flask tightly and tucked it inside my suit jacket pocket. I poured the remainder of the poisoned coffee down the porcelain sink, watching the dark liquid vanish down the drain. I rinsed the ceramic mug thoroughly with scalding hot water, ensuring no residue remained, then walked back into my bedroom. I set the empty mug on the nightstand. My heart pounded a furious rhythm. The sheer audacity of the scheme was staggering. The man my daughter was marrying was methodically poisoning me under my own roof. I realized in that exact moment that my sanctuary had been breached. Every shadow in my home concealed a mortal threat. Every interaction was a calculated move on a chessboard I did not realize I was playing on. I had to maintain the fragile illusion of a clueless, trusting old man. I adjusted my silk tie, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and prepared to face the ruthless monsters pretending to be my family. The wedding rehearsal lunch was held at an exclusive private dining club overlooking Lake Michigan. The elegant room was bathed in soft light, filled with the cheerful hum of clinking crystal and polite laughter. Audrey looked radiant in a flowing white dress, her eyes sparkling with unburdened joy. Sitting directly across from her, radiating an artificial southern charm, were Preston's parents, Richard and Susan. They supposedly flew in from Houston a few days prior. Preston had meticulously described them as wealthy generational Texas ranchers who owned massive tracts of land and managed incredibly lucrative crude oil interests. They certainly dressed the part. Richard wore a custom-tailored suit with subtle Western accents, while Susan displayed a collection of heavy diamond jewelry. But as I sat there watching them, my newly sharpened survival instincts began to pick up on minuscule, jarring details. Richard's posture was slightly too rigid for a man accustomed to wide-open spaces. He held his expensive silver cutlery with an awkward, rehearsed grip. Susan kept nervously checking the time on her watch, her bright smile flashing on and off like a programmed switch. During the appetizer course, I decided to test the structural integrity of their elaborate facade. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the white linen tablecloth, actively projecting the harmless image of a curious, welcoming patriarch, eager to know his new extended family. Richard I began keeping my voice loud enough for the table to hear. Preston tells me your massive ranch sits right on the edge of the Permian Basin. That is absolutely fascinating territory. In my active shipping days, we handled a massive, continuous volume of commercial freight moving straight out of that exact region. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, holding his gaze steadily. Richard offered a broad, highly practiced smile. It sure is, William. It is beautiful country down there, but it keeps us incredibly busy year-round. The livestock alone is a massive full-time job, not to mention managing the lucrative oil leases on the property. I nodded thoughtfully, leaning in just a fraction closer to spring the trap. I can only imagine the heavy workload. In fact, I was just reading an industry report about the severe new logistical bottlenecks down there. With the recent fluctuations in West Texas intermediate crude futures, how are you currently managing the strict pipeline capacity limits? Are you actively hedging your heavy freight tonnage on the commercial rail lines, or strictly sticking to the legacy overland transport contracts? The entire table went completely silent. It was a highly specific, aggressively technical question, brilliantly disguised as casual lunch conversation. A genuine Texas oil man managing generational wealth would have answered without a single second of hesitation. Richard froze entirely in his seat. The confident smile instantly vanished from his weathered face, replaced by a glaring look of sheer panic. He blinked rapidly, his jaw opening and closing silently, as he searched his mind for industry vocabulary that simply was not there. He stammered awkwardly, clearing his throat. Well, William, you know exactly how it is in the industry. The energy markets are always shifting on us. We usually just let our financial brokers handle the heavy lifting on the complex futures. He darted a desperate, wide-eyed look directly across the table at Preston. It was not a passing glance of mild confusion. It was a silent plea for immediate rescue. Preston smoothly intervened quickly, placing a reassuring hand on Richard's shoulder. Now, William, let us not bore the ladies with heavy oil logistics today. Dad is officially on vacation mode for the wedding week, and I promised him we would not talk business this weekend. I smiled warmly, leaning back into my comfortable chair. Of course, Preston. My sincere apologies. Richard, old corporate habits truly die hard. The table conversation quickly shifted back to the delicate floral arrangements, but my internal gut was absolutely screaming. Those nervous people were not wealthy Texas ranchers. They knew absolutely nothing about crude oil raw land management or commercial freight logistics. They were cheap paid actors hired to play a specific role in this grand production aimed at stealing my entire life. The tense lunch concluded, and we returned to the quiet of my estate. Audrey and the bridal party departed for a final dress fitting, leaving the house unnervingly still and entirely empty. I walked slowly through the grand marble foyer, feeling the oppressive weight of the deception pressing down on my shoulders. I was a hunted man surrounded by ruthless impostors fighting a desperate war in the halls of my own home. I bypassed the main living areas and headed straight for my private study. It was my secure inner sanctum, a room strictly off-limits to everyone, including the trusted household staff. I closed the heavy oak doors, ensuring the solid brass deadbolt clicked securely into place. I walked briskly over to the framed landscape painting hanging on the far wall. I swung the heavy wooden frame aside on its hidden metal hinges, revealing the reinforced steel floor safe embedded deeply within the thick masonry. It was a vault secured by a biometric thumbprint scanner and an advanced digital tracking log. I reached out to press my right thumb against the cool glass reader, but my hand stopped midair. The digital display screen located directly above the scanner, which usually remained dark until physically activated, was currently glowing with a faint red light. I leaned in much closer, my breath catching sharply in my throat. The digital screen displayed a stark, glaring message that chilled me to the bone. Error. 3 failed biometric attempts recorded. Timestamp. 10:15 a.m. Someone tried to breach my secure vault while I was sitting at lunch, looking into the eyes of the dangerous man who planned to bury me. The glaring red light of the biometric scanner burned deeply into my vision. 3 failed attempts. Preston was not just waiting for me to die. He was actively probing my defenses, trying to accelerate his timeline. I stared at the metal vault, my mind shifting gears from a grieving, betrayed father into the ruthless chief executive who had crushed rival shipping conglomerates. The time for passive observation was over. If Preston wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate espionage and murder under my roof, I was going to show him exactly why I was the one who built the empire. I needed absolute confirmation, and I needed it outside the compromised walls of my own estate. I locked the study and walked back into the main hallway, adopting the slow, shuffling gait of an exhausted old man. I poked my head into the kitchen, offering a weary smile. I told them I was feeling a bit congested and was going to run down to the local pharmacy to pick up some over-the-counter allergy medicine. Audrey offered to go for me, but I gently waved her off, insisting a short drive would do me good. Preston nodded approvingly, probably thrilled to have me out of the house so he could resume hunting for my financial documents. I drove my sedan out of the grand iron gates of the estate. I did not go to the pharmacy. Instead, I drove 30 minutes out to a quiet, unassuming suburban medical clinic. Dr. Samuel Aris ran the clinic. He had served as the chief medical officer for my shipping fleet for 2 decades. Samuel was a man of absolute discretion. We had weathered workplace accidents, union health disputes, and corporate health audits together. He was one of the very few men on this earth I trusted implicitly. I walked into his private back office and locked the door securely behind me. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pulled the sterilized travel flask from my inner jacket pocket and placed it firmly on his desk. I told him I needed an expedited chemical analysis of the liquid inside. I told him my life literally depended on it. Samuel asked absolutely no questions. He took the flask immediately into his adjoining private laboratory. I sat in his office for 2 agonizing hours, listening to the hum of the ventilation system. When Samuel finally emerged, his face was ashen. He slid a printed lab report across the desk. He told me the coffee was laced with a massive, concentrated dose of a synthetic beta blocker. He explained that in a man of my age with my specifically documented mild heart arrhythmia, that exact dosage would induce a catastrophic fatal myocardial infarction within minutes of ingestion. Furthermore, he noted that the synthetic nature of the compound meant it would break down rapidly in the bloodstream, rendering it virtually untraceable during a standard post-mortem autopsy. It was a perfectly designed, flawlessly executed murder weapon. I thanked Samuel, swore him to absolute secrecy, and left the clinic. The cold reality of the lab report eradicated any lingering traces of paternal hesitation. My future son-in-law was an active, lethal threat. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. From my parked car, I called Jonathan Mitchell, a ruthless corporate fixer who operated in the murky gray areas of the law. He was the man I called when competitors tried to sabotage my freighters or when hostile takeovers required aggressive countermeasures. I told him I had a critical security breach at the highest level of my personal life and needed an immediate covert intervention. Within 2 hours, Jonathan arranged a meeting at a secure, soundproofed suite in a downtown luxury hotel. I laid out the entire situation. I told him about the conversation in the fitting room, the fake parents at the rehearsal lunch, the tampered floor safe, and I handed him the toxicological report from Samuel. Jonathan did not express shock. He simply analyzed the data with cold, predatory efficiency. He agreed that going to the police right now was premature. Preston would claim the coffee was a mix-up or completely deny the plot, and Audrey would undoubtedly defend him. We needed airtight, irrefutable evidence of his criminal intent. We devised a plan. The next morning, Audrey and Preston were scheduled to attend a lengthy mandatory meeting with the cathedral coordinator to finalize the seating arrangements. The moment their vehicle cleared the front gates, Jonathan and his specialized technical team arrived at my estate disguised as a routine heating and cooling maintenance crew. They moved through my home with military precision. They did not touch the existing security cameras, knowing Preston was likely monitoring them. Instead, they installed state-of-the-art microscopic audio and video recording devices directly into the hardwired smoke detectors in every major room of the house. The study, the dining room, the main hallways, and the guest suite where Preston was staying. The entire installation took less than 45 minutes. Jonathan handed me a secure, encrypted tablet paired directly to the hidden network. The feeds were completely isolated from the estate's main Wi-Fi, ensuring Preston could not detect the massive bandwidth usage. I was now watching my own home through an invisible, omniscient lens. I could not stay in the house that evening. I needed a secure environment to monitor the feeds and strategize my next move without having to constantly manage my facial expressions around the man trying to kill me. I told Audrey I was checking into a suite at the hotel for the night to get some uninterrupted rest before the chaotic wedding weekend officially began. She seemed disappointed, but accepted my excuse while Preston offered a perfectly tailored smile of understanding. I sat alone in the dim light of my hotel room, the encrypted tablet propped up on the mahogany desk in front of me. The digital feeds displayed the quiet, empty rooms of my estate. It was past midnight. The house appeared completely still. I watched the black and white infrared feed of the main hallway, waiting patiently. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, the hallway feed flickered with movement. A shadow slipped out of the guest bedroom. It was Preston. He was fully dressed in dark clothing, moving with practiced silent steps down the corridor. I switched my view to the camera positioned in the ceiling of my private study. The heavy oak doors of the study were secured by an advanced digital keypad, separate from the main house alarm. It was a system I believed only I controlled. I watched in absolute silence as Preston approached the keypad. He did not ever hesitate. He did not guess. He smoothly punched in a complex 8-digit numerical sequence. The green light flashed and the heavy door swung open. My blood ran totally cold. He had completely bypassed the alarm system using Audrey's personal master code. He stepped inside quietly, pulling a small metallic flashlight from his pocket, scanning the room. My own beloved daughter had unknowingly given him the exact keys to my absolute destruction. I watched through the glowing screen of my tablet as Preston moved methodically around my private study. He did not rifle through drawers like a common thief. He knew exactly what he was looking for. He used his small flashlight to illuminate the spines of my corporate ledgers, his gloved hands gently shifting documents on my mahogany desk. He spent nearly 20 minutes taking high-resolution photographs of my private bank routing numbers and offshore shipping manifests. I sat in my hotel room, my coffee growing cold, absorbing the sheer violation of my life's work. He thought he was outsmarting an old fool. He had absolutely no idea he was giving me a masterclass in his own methodology. When he finally slipped back out, quietly resetting the alarm keypad, I closed the tablet. The time for observation had ended. I needed to feed his arrogance. I needed him to believe his lethal timeline was progressing perfectly. The following morning, I returned to the estate just as the sun was rising over the lake. Before stepping out of my vehicle, I reached into the trunk and retrieved a heavy silver-handled walking cane that had belonged to my late father. It had gathered dust for decades. Today, it would become the anchor of my performance. I practiced my posture in the reflection of the car window. I slumped my shoulders forward, allowing a slight tremor to enter my hands. I took shallow, labored breaths. When I finally walked through the massive front doors of my home, I made sure my heavy footsteps echoed with frailty. The physical transformation was deeply uncomfortable, but it was absolutely necessary. I shuffled slowly toward the grand dining room, where the scent of roasted coffee and fresh pastries filled the air. Audrey and Preston were already seated at the long table going over floral arrangements. As I entered the room, I let my cane strike the hardwood floor with a loud, clumsy thud. I paused in the doorway, placing a trembling hand over my chest, squeezing my eyes shut as if fighting through a wave of intense pain. Audrey dropped her wedding binder immediately. She rushed to my side, her face pale with genuine concern. "Dad, are you all right?" she asked, wrapping her arm around my waist to support my weight. I forced a weak, breathless smile, patting her hand gently. "I am fine, sweetheart. Just a bit winded this morning. The damp weather always makes my old heart work a little harder." Preston was on his feet in an instant. He pulled out my heavy oak chair, his face entirely composed of deep, sickeningly fake sympathy. He placed a warm hand on my shoulder, guiding me into the seat with the gentle care one might reserve for a dying man. "Take it easy," William Preston murmured softly. "You really need to stop pushing yourself so hard. We want you healthy and strong to walk Audrey down the aisle on Saturday." The sheer hypocrisy of his words made my stomach churn, but I nodded graciously. "You are entirely right, Preston. In fact, this little spell has made me realize something important." I looked back and forth between them, letting my voice drop to a raspy, exhausted whisper. "I am tired. I am so incredibly tired of managing the fleet, the accounts, the endless corporate liabilities. My memory is simply not what it used to be. I am forgetting details. I feel myself slipping." Audrey gripped my hand tightly, tears welling in her eyes, completely unaware that she was comforting a man putting on the performance of a lifetime. I turned my gaze directly to the man planning to murder me. "Preston," I said, leaning heavily against the table, "I do not want to wait until after the honeymoon to settle our affairs. I want to finalize the trust documents immediately. I want the entire corporate merger completed today. I want to sign everything so I can finally rest." Preston's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. It was the absolute thrill of a predator watching its prey willingly walk into a snare. He quickly masked his elation with a solemn, respectful nod. If that is what you truly want, William, I will have the final comprehensive tax shield documents printed and brought to your study this afternoon. We can review every single page together. I shook my head slowly, feigning immense fatigue. No review, Preston. My eyes are too tired for the fine print today. Just bring me the finalized stack. I trust you to have handled the heavy lifting. I will sign them in my room so I can rest before the rehearsal dinner. True to his word, Preston knocked on my bedroom door precisely at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He carried a thick leather portfolio overflowing with complex legal contracts. He handed them over with a look of profound, manufactured respect, assuring me that every single clause had been drafted to guarantee Audrey's financial invulnerability. I took the heavy portfolio with shaking hands, thanked him profusely for his dedication to our family, and gently closed the door. The moment the lock clicked, my trembling hands became completely steady. I walked over to my desk and tossed the documents aside. I did not need to read them to know they were designed to systematically strip me of every single asset I had spent 40 years accumulating. I sat down and opened my encrypted tablet connecting to the network of hidden microcameras Jonathan's team had installed throughout the estate. I needed to verify that my performance was having the desired psychological effect. I spent the next several quiet hours monitoring the live feeds. I watched the household staff moving about the kitchen, preparing for the festivities. I watched Audrey organizing seating charts in the living room, completely blind to the viper slithering through her home. And I watched Preston. He was pacing the downstairs study, talking animatedly on his cellular phone. Although I could not hear his conversation, his body language was entirely relaxed, victorious and brimming with arrogance. My decoy strategy was working perfectly. He believed he had completely subdued the fierce patriarch of the Stanton family without firing a shot. He thought his timeline was accelerating smoothly toward his ultimate triumph. As the grand estate settled into the quiet darkness of the night, I continued to scan the video feeds. I was about to close the application and attempt to sleep when a sudden movement on the second-floor hallway camera caught my eye. It was 2 a.m. The corridor was illuminated only by the pale glow of the moon. I leaned closer to the bright digital screen, my pulse quickening. The heavy wooden door to the guest bedroom slowly swung open. Valerie, the supposed best friend, stepped out into the silent hallway. She wore a silk robe, looking left and right to ensure the corridor was deserted. Preston emerged from the shadows near the staircase. He approached her, swiftly pinning her against the wallpaper. I stared at the screen as Valerie wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, and they began kissing in the dark hallway of my home. I watched the brightly glowing screen of the encrypted tablet until the lovers finally pulled apart and slipped back into the shadows of the guest suite. My breathing felt unnaturally shallow in the quiet isolation of my hotel room. The sheer scale of the deception was expanding at a terrifying velocity. Preston was not acting alone. He had strategically planted an accomplice right beside my daughter. Valerie had integrated herself into Audrey's life over a year ago, portraying herself as a supportive confidant and a fellow equestrian enthusiast. Now the absolute truth was glaringly obvious. She was the inside operative meticulously steering my vulnerable daughter directly into the waiting jaws of a merciless predator. I did not attempt to sleep that night. I paced the carpeted floor, clutching my cellular phone, my mind racing through every single conversation and shared dinner we ever had. I analyzed every smile, every compliment, and every seemingly innocent question they had directed at my daughter. It was an elaborate stage play, and I was intended to be the tragic casualty. At the very first light of dawn, I called Jonathan Mitchell. I told him the physical surveillance had yielded immediate damning results, but we needed to escalate our tactical approach. I demanded a complete, unrestricted cyber investigation into every digital footprint Preston and Valerie had ever left behind. Jonathan assured me his team of data extraction specialists would tear through their encrypted communications by the afternoon. I dressed in a fresh suit and prepared to return to the estate. Walking back into my house that morning, required an agonizing level of emotional control. I found the happy trio gathered in the sunlit breakfast nook, casually finalizing the catering menu. Audrey was laughing brightly at a joke Valerie had just made, completely oblivious to the venomous snake coiled beside her. "Good morning, Dad," Audrey sang out cheerfully, pouring me a cup of tea. Valerie sends her apologies, but she has to steal me away for a bridal spa day this afternoon. I offered a warm, grandfatherly smile, taking my seat at the head of the table. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. You both deserve a day of pampering before the weekend chaos begins." I watched Valerie carefully butter her toast, acting the role of the excited friend with sickening perfection. Preston looked up from his tablet, projecting the image of a devoted, hard-working groom. "And I will be heading downtown to meet with the trust attorneys, William. I want to make certain all the documentation is perfectly bulletproof before we finalize the signatures." I nodded approvingly, taking a slow sip of my tea. "Excellent initiative, Preston. I appreciate your unwavering dedication to this family." Every word tasted like bile, but I played my part flawlessly. The moment they all left the estate to pursue their various scheduled activities, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure text message from Jonathan. It contained a single highly encrypted address and a time. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I drove to a stark, unmarked industrial building, situated on the gritty outskirts of the city. Jonathan was waiting for me inside a stark, windowless conference room, illuminated entirely by the harsh glare of several high-definition monitors. His elite cyber team was actively running complex decryption algorithms across the screens. "William, have a seat," Jonathan said, his voice entirely devoid of pleasantries. He pointed a laser pen at the primary display monitor. "We breached their offshore communications servers. The man you currently know as Preston Vance does not actually exist. The name is a complete fabrication supported by high-level forged documents and a meticulously scrubbed digital history." I stared at the scrolling lines of data, feeling a chilling sense of validation. "Who is he really?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "His actual name is Julian Croft," Jonathan explained, tapping a key to bring up a series of international banking records. "He is not a wealthy investment banker or a legitimate corporate consultant. He is a highly sophisticated top-tier grifter directly connected to a notorious offshore criminal syndicate operating primarily out of the Caribbean and South America. These people are entirely ruthless and leave absolutely no loose ends. They specialize exclusively in aggressive long-term asset extraction." I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted police reports and flagged wire transfers appearing on the screens. "Asset extraction," I repeated slowly. "Explain their methodology to me, Jonathan." Jonathan folded his arms across his broad chest, his expression remaining entirely stoic. "They do not bother with petty theft or standard corporate espionage. They target a very specific demographic. They aggressively hunt wealthy, emotionally isolated widowers or aging patriarchs who control massive liquid estates. They utilize a network of attractive, highly trained operatives to infiltrate the target family, usually by seducing a lonely heir or a vulnerable daughter. Once the operative secures legal standing through marriage, they initiate the final phase." "The final phase," I murmured quietly, recalling the lethal synthetic beta blockers currently resting in a sterilized flask inside my personal wall safe. "The final phase is a staged medical emergency," Jonathan confirmed grimly. "They induce a fatal cardiac event using untraceable chemical agents. Following the tragic sudden death of the patriarch, the operative steps in as the grieving spouse to console the devastated heir. They quickly liquidate the inherited assets, funnel the millions through a complex maze of untraceable shell companies, and vanish without a single trace. You are their current target, William. This entire wedding is a meticulously constructed execution chamber." I absorbed the horrifying reality of his words. They had manipulated Audrey perfectly. They used her grief, her need for companionship, and her deep desire for a supportive partner to build their deadly trap. "And what about Valerie?" I asked, feeling a cold, calculating rage solidifying in my chest. What is her specific role in this syndicate? Why would a sophisticated grifter need an inside operative to pose as a best friend? Jonathan did not answer immediately. He turned back to his primary keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys with rapid, aggressive precision. He pulled up a scanned, heavily authenticated legal document. It was entirely in Spanish, stamped with the official seal of the National Registry of San Jose. The biggest shock is not the criminal syndicate, William Jonathan said, quietly, stepping aside so I could view the monitor clearly. My team dug deeply into the restricted government archives of Costa Rica. We pulled their foundational documentation. I stared at the brightly glowing screen. It was a certified marriage certificate dated 4 years ago. The names printed on the official document were Julian Croft and Valerie Sterling. My breath caught in my throat as the devastating truth slammed into me. Valerie was not just a fellow grifter. She was not a supportive confidant or an innocent bridesmaid. She was his legally wedded wife. They had been working together from the absolute beginning, simply laughing at us. Every single moment they spent under my roof was a calculated, perfectly rehearsed performance designed to entirely dismantle my family. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute magnitude of their horrific betrayal wash over my exhausted soul. The drive back to my estate was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I had left Jonathan Mitchell in that windowless room with a singular, strict directive. We were going to utterly obliterate Julian Croft, his fraudulent wife, and the offshore syndicate funding their murderous operation. Jonathan had rapidly drafted a highly specialized countermeasure for the immediate threat. He provided me with a specific, legally binding alias. It was a corporate phantom signature completely indistinguishable from my actual handwriting to the untrained eye, but registered under a covert shell corporation that Jonathan controlled. If I signed the trust merger with that alias, it would legally trap the forged entity in a federal fraud snare, freezing every asset and triggering an automatic investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I parked in the circular driveway and took several deep, measured breaths. I let the anger drain away, replacing it with the manufactured fragility of a dying man. I hunched my shoulders, allowing my hands to adopt a subtle tremor. I shuffled into my private study, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a reassuring click. The late afternoon sunlight cast long, dark shadows across the Persian rugs. I seated myself behind the mahogany desk, sinking deeply into the leather chair. I intentionally knocked a stack of shipping manifests onto the floor, leaving them scattered in a disorganized mess. I unbuttoned my collar, ruffled my gray hair, and let my jaw hang slightly slack. Less than 20 minutes later, a confident knock echoed through the quiet room. Before I could issue a verbal response, the door swung open. Preston stepped inside, carrying the thick leather portfolio under his arm. He wore a tailored navy suit, looking every inch the reliable future son-in-law. But knowing what I now knew, I could see the predatory gleam in his dark eyes. He was a vulture circling a wounded animal. "William," he said softly, closing the door behind him and locking it with a deliberate metallic click. "I brought the finalized trust merger documents. You mentioned this morning that you wanted to settle your affairs before the rehearsal dinner tonight." I looked up at him, forcing my eyes to appear cloudy. I blinked several times as if struggling to recognize the man standing in my very own study. "Ah, Preston." I mumbled, my voice raspy and remarkably weak. "Yes, the documents. Thank you. My memory has been absolutely terrible today. I feel like I am swimming through a dense fog." I rubbed my temples with trembling fingers, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of a senile, defeated old man. Preston approached the desk, his movements smooth and practiced. He set the leather portfolio down directly in front of me, sweeping the scattered manifests out of the way with a look of pure disdain. He unzipped the leather casing and withdrew a thick stack of legal papers, placing a solid gold fountain pen beside them. "It is perfectly fine, William," he purred smoothly, his voice dripping with weaponized sympathy. You have carried the heavy burden of this massive shipping empire for far too long. That is exactly why Audrey and I are here. We want to take this heavy weight off your shoulders so you can finally rest. You just need to sign on the highlighted lines. I stared down at the documents, my hands shaking so violently that I knocked the gold pen across the polished wood. Preston quickly caught it, handing it back to me with a tight, patient smile. The psychological warfare in the room was suffocating. He was projecting the image of a savior while I projected the image of a helpless victim. I picked up the heavy pen, letting it slip clumsily through my fingers once before gripping it awkwardly. "Are you absolutely certain this protects Audrey?" I asked, letting a note of desperate pleading enter my voice. "I do not want her dealing with corporate vultures when I am gone." Preston leaned over the desk, placing his hands flat on the mahogany surface. He looked directly into my eyes, projecting unwavering sincerity. "William, I swear to you on my life, this merger guarantees that Audrey will never have to worry about a single financial threat. I have structured this vault to be completely impenetrable. She will have everything she ever needs, and I will be right by her side to manage it. You have my absolute solemn word." It took every ounce of my willpower not to drive the sharp nib of the fountain pen directly into his smiling face. Instead, I let out a long, ragged sigh of ultimate defeat. "Thank you, Preston. You are a good man." I lowered my head, bringing the pen down to the thick, textured paper. The document was a masterpiece of legal deception designed to irrevocably transfer my net worth into a holding company controlled by Julian Croft and Valerie Sterling. I pressed the gold nib against the signature line. I controlled my breathing, ensuring my hand trembled perfectly as I formed the letters. I did not sign my real name. I meticulously inscribed the specific legal alias Jonathan had created for this exact moment. The signature looked identical to my own, mimicking the loops and sharp angles of my genuine handwriting, but deliberate variations in the spacing transformed it into a legally distinct entity. It was a digital bear trap. I signed my fake name on the first page, then the second, playing the pathetic part of an exhausted elder struggling with a simple physical task. Preston stood over me, his breathing shallow with anticipation. He was vibrating with barely contained excitement. As I slowly signed the seventh and final page, he reached out, eager to snatch the finalized, completed documents away. I let the pen slip from my fingers. It clattered onto the desk. I slumped back heavily into my leather chair, letting my arms fall limply to my sides. I closed my eyes, letting my head roll slightly to the right. I slowed my breathing until it was a soft, rhythmic wheeze mimicking an old man who had exhausted his final reserves of energy and slipped into a deep sleep. The study was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. I kept my muscles relaxed, offering no resistance. I heard the rustle of thick paper as Preston gathered the signed documents. I heard the sharp zip of the portfolio closing. He had won. Or so he believed. I waited for the sound of his footsteps retreating toward the heavy door. I expected him to walk away and celebrate his victory. But the footsteps did not retreat. Instead, they moved closer. I felt a shift in the air pressure as Preston leaned directly over my chair. I could smell the faint cologne on his tailored suit. He leaned down until his mouth was mere inches from my ear. The charming facade vanished, replaced by a voice so cold and malevolent it sent a shockwave through my system. "Do not worry, old man," he whispered, the venom dripping from every single syllable. "I will take exceptionally good care of your precious little girl once you are in the ground." The chilling breath from his whisper lingered against my ear as he slowly pulled away. I kept my breathing utterly shallow, my eyes closed, my entire body perfectly still, completely locked into the physical performance of a vulnerable, sleeping old man. I heard the sharp metallic zip of the leather portfolio closing, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of his expensive leather shoes crossing the hardwood floor. The brass doorknob turned, and the heavy oak door clicked shut. He was gone. The moment I was entirely alone, my eyes snapped open. I sat up slowly, feeling a cold, dark wave of absolute fury settle deep into my bones. Preston, or rather Julian Croft, had just guaranteed his own absolute destruction. He was no longer just a predator looking for a quick payday. He was a monster who planned to feast on the very soul of my family. I did not waste a single second. I immediately reached for the encrypted tablet Jonathan Mitchell had provided, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard to initiate a secure video conference. Jonathan appeared on the screen almost instantly. He was sitting in the same windowless Stark Industrial Command Center, surrounded by the glowing monitors of his elite cyber team. His face was exceptionally grim, lacking any of the professional detachment I had seen earlier. William, Jonathan said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. My lead hackers just managed to crack the secondary encryption layer on the offshore servers used by Julian Croft and Valerie Sterling. We intercepted a series of highly classified dark web email communications between Julian and the highest-ranking members of the South American syndicate. What you signed today was only the beginning. I stared at the screen, gripping the edges of the mahogany desk. I used the phantom alias Jonathan. The documents are legally invalid. I trapped him. I know you did, Jonathan replied smoothly, leaning closer to the camera. But you need to understand the full devastating scope of what they actually planned to do if those signatures had been genuine. This was never just about a simple corporate takeover or a quick $50 million cash grab. They were not planning to leave Audrey grieving with a modest allowance. They planned to completely annihilate her. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Explain it to me, Jonathan. Give me every single detail. Jonathan pulled up a deeply complex digital schematic on his screen, showing a massive web of offshore bank accounts, corporate holding entities, and international wire transfers. The trust merger document you signed was specifically designed to route your entire liquid shipping fortune directly into a blind trust. But Julian did not list himself as the primary beneficiary or the executing officer. He listed Audrey as the sole corporate executor with absolute fiduciary liability. I frowned, my mind struggling to process the incredibly dense legal maneuvering. Why would he give Audrey the liability? If he wants to steal the money, he needs direct access. He has direct access through her, Jonathan explained with ruthless clarity. He is marrying her. As her legal husband, he has established joint authority over her accounts. The dark web emails lay out the entire timeline with terrifying precision. Tomorrow, after you consume the lethal beta blockers in your coffee and pass away from an apparent heart attack, the trust will immediately activate. The $50 million will drop into the blind account. Over the following 48 hours, while Audrey is entirely consumed by absolute grief and planning your funeral, Julian and Valerie will quietly initiate a series of massive, untraceable wire transfers. They will funnel every single cent of that $50 million out of the country, moving it through dozens of shell companies until it completely vanishes into the syndicate structure. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. And then what happens? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Then they vanish, Jonathan said, his tone perfectly flat. Julian and Valerie will simply board a private charter flight and disappear forever. But they will leave behind a meticulously constructed paper trail. They have fabricated dozens of emails and forged financial directives that make it look exactly as if Audrey orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme herself. They are going to completely bankrupt your legacy shipping conglomerate, destroy your life's work, and leave Audrey holding the smoking gun. When the federal authorities inevitably investigate the missing $50 million, they will not find a grieving widow who was conned by a masterful grifter. They will find a massive trail of forged digital evidence pointing directly at your daughter. She will be framed for the largest corporate embezzlement in the history of the city. She will face decades in federal prison, and her life will be completely, irreparably destroyed. The sheer magnitude of their absolute cruelty hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I leaned back in my chair, staring blindly at the ceiling of my study. They were not just thieves. They were architects of complete human ruin. They intended to murder me, steal the empire I spent 4 decades building with my bare hands, and then throw my only beloved child into a federal penitentiary to cover their tracks. It was a level of pure, unadulterated evil that defied basic human comprehension. The rage that had been simmering inside me suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It became a singular, cold, unbreakable focus. I was no longer just a father trying to stop a bad marriage. I was a protector preparing for absolute war. "Jonathan," I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any fear or hesitation. "We proceed with the primary countermeasure exactly as planned. We let them think they are winning until the very last possible second. I want every single digital trap armed and ready to deploy the moment he attempts to move that money." "Consider it done," William Jonathan replied confidently. "We have complete oversight of their digital architecture. The moment he logs into that offshore portal, we will lock the accounts, freeze his assets, and send the unredacted evidence file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I terminated the secure connection and slowly closed the tablet, locking it safely away inside my desk drawer. I took a moment to adjust my physical posture, once again, ensuring my shoulders were appropriately slumped, and my expression conveyed the deep, lingering fatigue of a sickly old man. I needed to maintain the absolute illusion of vulnerability for just a little bit longer. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair, leaning heavily on the silver-handled cane I had retrieved from my vehicle earlier. Before I could even take a single step toward the door, a bright, cheerful knock echoed through the quiet room. The heavy oak door swung open with a burst of energetic movement. Audrey practically skipped into the study, her face glowing with genuine happiness and relief. The sheer contrast between her radiant joy and the dark, horrifying truth I had just uncovered was almost too much to bear. I forced a warm, gentle smile onto my face, gripping the head of my cane tightly to stop my hands from visibly trembling. "Dad, you are awake," she said happily, rushing over to me and wrapping her arms around my neck in a tight, affectionate embrace. "I am so glad you finally got some rest. Preston told me you successfully signed the trust merger documents this afternoon. He said you were completely exhausted, but incredibly relieved to have the corporate burdens lifted." I patted her back gently, returning the embrace with all the profound love I held for her. "Yes, sweetheart," I murmured softly. "I signed everything exactly as he requested. I am just focusing entirely on resting now." She pulled back, her eyes shining with absolute adoration for the monster waiting downstairs. "I know you were so incredibly hesitant at first, Dad, but Preston truly is looking out for our family. He has been so incredibly protective and diligent. In fact, he actually insisted on finalizing one more piece of paperwork today, just to ensure we are completely covered from every possible angle." She reached into the pocket of her casual cardigan and pulled out a crisply folded, heavily embossed legal document. She held it out to me with a bright, entirely unsuspecting smile. "He spent the entire morning working with an elite brokerage firm downtown to secure this for you. It is a comprehensive $10 million life insurance policy, Dad. He fully paid the massive upfront premium himself. He told me he wanted to purchase it completely independently, just to guarantee that our family is financially shielded, just in case anything sudden or terrible happens to you before the wedding." I stared at the heavily embossed document in her hands, my chest tightening with a sickening mixture of sorrow and rage. A $10 million life insurance policy. It was the final critical piece of Julian Croft's deadly puzzle. He needed a guaranteed, untraceable payout, directly tied to my imminent demise to supplement the stolen fortune. I reached out with trembling fingers, taking the crisp paper from my daughter. I looked into her beautiful, trusting eyes, forcing a tear of manufactured gratitude to slide down my weathered cheek. "Audrey," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I am completely overwhelmed by his incredible kindness. I truly misjudged him from the very beginning. Please tell Preston that I am deeply moved by his unwavering dedication to your future together." She beamed brightly, leaning down to kiss my forehead softly, before quietly slipping out of the room to let me rest for the evening. The moment the door clicked shut, the fragile mask of the grateful father vanished entirely. I threw the life insurance policy onto the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The audacity of this offshore criminal syndicate was staggering to comprehend. They were not content with stealing my life savings and framing my daughter for the embezzlement. They wanted to monetize my corpse, to extract every cent of value from my murder. I checked the display on my wristwatch. It was rapidly approaching the midnight hour. The sprawling estate had fallen into a deep silence as the staff retired to their quarters. The time for passive observation was over. It was finally time to spring the devastating counterattack. I retrieved the encrypted tablet from my drawer and initiated a direct, secure connection to Jonathan Mitchell. His stoic face materialized on the glowing digital screen within mere seconds. The shadowy command center behind him was a hive of quiet, urgent activity. I held up the newly acquired life insurance document to the camera lens. They just finalized the secondary payout structure, Jonathan. The timeline is accelerating much more rapidly than we anticipated. The wedding is in less than 48 hours, and my execution is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Jonathan did not flinch at the dire news. Then we initiate the financial blackout right now, William. My cyber team is standing by at their terminals. Give the verbal authorization to commence the operation. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves for the decision ahead. Execute the phantom protocol, I ordered with an icy resolve. On Jonathan's end of the secure connection, a sudden flurry of frantic keystrokes filled the audio feed. The specific legal alias you used to sign the trust merger is now actively flagged within the federal banking registry, Jonathan reported smoothly. His dark eyes darted back and forth, tracking the scrolling lines of illuminated data cascading across his monitors. The incredibly subtle pre-planned variations in your handwriting pattern have triggered the automated fraud defense algorithms. The physical document Julian Croft currently holds is completely and legally nullified. If he foolishly attempts to present that specific merger agreement to any legitimate financial institution, it will instantly generate a Tier 1 federal alert for corporate fraud. The legal trap is officially armed and inescapable. That maneuver was only the first layer of our multifaceted defense strategy. We needed to protect the actual capital before he could attempt to breach the firewall. Jonathan, shift the liquid assets right now, I commanded sharply. Do not leave those ruthless monsters a single viable financial target to exploit. I watched the reflection of Jonathan's glowing primary monitor dancing across the lenses of his glasses. We are initiating the massive capital transfer protocol now, he confirmed with absolute certainty. We are safely routing the entire $50 million holding directly into the newly established irrevocable blind trust structure. This specific, highly classified financial vehicle is entirely insulated from any external corporate access or unauthorized manipulation. It strictly requires your physical biometric verification at a secure Federal Reserve branch to authorize any future withdrawals. Julian and his syndicate hackers simply cannot touch this capital. The digital security walls surrounding it are completely unequivocally impenetrable. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming weight lift from my tired shoulders as I watched the green confirmation screens pop up one by one. The massive fortune I had spent 4 grueling decades building the money solely intended to secure my daughter's future was finally safe from the dangerous predators currently sleeping inside my home. But we were not quite finished with our retaliation. I desperately wanted to leave Julian Croft a very specific, profoundly humiliating message when he inevitably logged in to steal my life. Leave exactly $1,000 in the primary target account, I instructed with a cold, hollow laugh. Let him foolishly think the initial transfer actually succeeded without a single hitch. Let him see a pathetic balance when he attempts to empty the vault tomorrow. Jonathan offered a rare, remarkably dark smile in return. The humiliating decoy balance is perfectly set, William. Exactly $1,000 remains untouched in the compromised account. It is officially time to deploy the poison pill. I leaned aggressively forward, resting my elbows firmly on the solid mahogany desk. Link the hijacked account directly to the toxic corporate liabilities, I said smoothly. A massive global shipping conglomerate of my incredible size always carried highly strategic, heavily leveraged debt. I had recently acquired a severely depreciated, outdated fleet of rusting cargo freighters, carrying a staggering, insurmountable liability of exactly $15 million. I had initially planned to patiently restructure it over the next entire decade. Instead, I was graciously giving it away to my future son-in-law as an early wedding gift. Jonathan rapidly executed the complex, highly sensitive digital maneuvers on his end. "The corporate integration is completely verified," he stated flatly. "The compromised target account is now legally tethered as the primary financial collateral for the $15 million corporate debt. When Julian attempts to illegally drain the funds and triggers the automated ownership transfer, he will instantly bypass the corporate shield and assume total personal legal responsibility for the entire $15 million deficit. The precise moment he tries to steal your hard-earned wealth, he will inadvertently bankrupt his own criminal syndicate." It was a completely flawless, utterly devastating counterattack. I thanked Jonathan sincerely and immediately terminated the secure video connection. I walked slowly toward the large bay window of my study, drawing back the heavy velvet curtains just a fraction of an inch to look out into the dark night. The sprawling grounds of my estate were bathed in the pale, eerie light of the full moon. The manicured lawns stretched silently toward the distant wrought iron security gates, but the perimeter was no longer empty. Idling silently on the dark, narrow access road just beyond my property line were two massive, unmarked black sport utility vehicles. Their front headlights were completely extinguished, their tinted windows reflecting the surrounding forest. They sat there, like silent mechanical predators waiting in the darkness. My blood ran completely cold. Julian was not acting alone anymore. The ruthless thugs from the offshore criminal syndicate had officially arrived for the wedding. I looked at the heavy parchment in my hands, my heart hardening into a solid block of ice. I offered my precious daughter a trembling, tearful smile, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Tell Preston I am deeply touched by his incredible generosity," I whispered into her hair, playing the role of the overwhelmed patriarch to absolute perfection. I assured her I would rest, and as she left the room, I locked the document inside my safe. The final nail in the coffin of Julian Croft arrived. The evening descended quickly, bringing with it the grand rehearsal dinner. It was hosted in the opulent private dining room of a historic downtown restaurant, a space adorned with crystal chandeliers and heavy mahogany paneling. I arrived wearing a tailored charcoal suit, leaning heavily on my silver-handled cane, projecting the fragile image of a man whose health was rapidly failing. The sheer suffocating tension in the room was almost thick enough to cut with a knife. I took my designated seat at the head of the long, beautifully decorated table, smiling warmly at the collection of ruthless monsters who were actively planning my murder. Preston sat directly to my right, holding Audrey by her hand, his handsome face fixed in an expression of unwavering devotion. Valerie was seated just down the table, laughing brightly at a joke my daughter had made, playing the supportive best friend flawlessly. Directly across from me sat Richard and Susan, the hired actors masquerading as wealthy Texas oil tycoons. Their southern accents were thick, their smiles wide, but I could see the underlying anxiety in their posture. They were low-level grifters brought in to play a supporting role, completely unaware of the lethal depths of their true syndicate operation. I chewed my prime rib methodically, sipping sparkling water, while the rest of the table enjoyed expensive vintage wines. Every clink of a glass, every burst of laughter, felt incredibly grotesque. I watched Julian Croft charm the waitstaff and whisper sweet nothings to Audrey, knowing he fully intended to destroy her entire existence in less than 24 hours. I let the dinner proceed naturally, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to strike my first surgical blow against his supporting cast. As the final dessert plates were being cleared away, the lively conversation shifted toward the complex logistical schedule for the following morning. I noticed Susan lean over and whisper something urgently to Richard. Richard nodded quickly, excusing himself from the table and heading toward the private restrooms located down a quiet, heavily carpeted corridor near the front entrance. Susan followed closely behind him, clutching her expensive designer purse. This was my opening. I placed my linen napkin on the table, offered a weak apology about needing to stretch my aching legs, and slowly shuffled out of the dining room. I navigated the quiet hallway, leaving the sounds of clinking silverware behind. I did not enter the restroom. Instead, I stepped silently into the dimly lit coat room situated directly across the hall. The space was filled with long racks of expensive jackets and heavy wool coats smelling strongly of cedar and expensive perfume. I waited in the shadows, my posture straightening, the trembling in my hands completely vanishing. Within 3 minutes, the heavy wooden door pushed open. Richard and Susan stepped inside the coat room to retrieve a small leather bag Susan had checked earlier. I stepped out of the shadows, blocking their physical exit. They both jumped, startled by my sudden, completely silent appearance. William Richard stammered, his fake southern drawl slipping for a fraction of a second. "You truly startled us. Are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale." I did not smile. I did not hunch my shoulders. I stood at my full height, staring down at them with a look of absolute, unyielding authority. My voice was a low, dangerous whisper that completely shattered the fragile illusion I had maintained for days. "Your real name is Thomas Vance," I said smoothly, watching the color instantly drain from his weathered face. "And your lovely wife is actually Martha Vance. You both currently reside in a remarkably run-down apartment complex in South Miami. You have an extensive, highly documented history of minor check fraud and low-level corporate embezzlement. Furthermore, Thomas, you currently have 2 outstanding federal warrants for interstate wire fraud, originating from a botched real estate scam in Atlanta 3 years ago." Martha gasped out loud, dropping her small designer purse onto the carpeted floor. Thomas stepped back, raising his hands in a frantic defensive gesture. "Look here, William," he began, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "We did not want to cause any trouble. Preston just hired us to play a simple part. He said it was just a harmless social enhancement to impress your wealthy family." I took a step closer, backing them into the heavy rows of winter coats. "Do not dare lie to me, Thomas. You are participating in a massive federal conspiracy to embezzle $50 million from my estate. Did Julian Croft tell you about the lethal synthetic beta blockers he plans to put in my morning coffee tomorrow? Did he mention that your involvement in this elaborate stage play makes you both direct accomplices to premeditated capital murder?" Their eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. They were cheap hustlers, totally unprepared for the lethal reality of the syndicate they had aligned themselves with. "Murder," Martha whimpered, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. No, we never agreed to anything involving violence. He just told us to smile and talk about crude oil futures." I pulled a folded document from my inner jacket pocket and pressed it firmly against his chest. "It is a complete dossier containing your real identities, your extensive criminal records, and your current outstanding federal warrants," I whispered coldly. "My private security team has already transmitted this entire file to the local authorities, but they are holding off on execution. You have exactly one option to walk away from this estate without spending the remainder of your miserable lives in a federal penitentiary. Tell us what you want us to do." Thomas pleaded desperately, completely abandoning the wealthy rancher persona. "We will do absolutely anything you ask, William. We just want to get out of here alive." "You will attend the wedding tomorrow morning exactly as planned," I instructed sharply. "You will sit in the front row, you will smile for the cameras, and you will not say a single word to Julian Croft or Valerie Sterling about this conversation. When the ceremony concludes, you will quietly walk to the rear exit of the cathedral. My private security team will be waiting there in a black sedan. They will hand you new passports and $50,000 in unmarked cash. You will immediately board a flight to South America and never return to the United States. If you deviate from these instructions by even a single syllable, I will personally ensure the federal authorities crush you." "We understand," Thomas whispered frantically. "We will obey." Before I could issue another command, the heavy door swung open. Preston stood there, his eyes narrowing. His gaze darted sharply between Thomas, Martha, and myself. The dim light of the coat room cast harsh shadows across his handsome, fabricated face. The predatory instinct radiating from his rigid posture was unmistakable. He sensed a disruption in his meticulously controlled environment. "What exactly is going on in here?" he demanded smoothly, though a distinct layer of venom coated his voice. I immediately allowed my shoulders to slump, releasing a heavy, rattling breath. I let my silver-handled cane tremble against the carpeted floor. Martha, bless her terrified soul, proved to be an exceptional actress under the threat of federal imprisonment. "Oh, Preston, dear," she gushed, stepping forward and placing a reassuring hand on his impeccably tailored arm. "Your future father-in-law just had a minor dizzy spell in the hallway. Thomas and I were simply helping him catch his breath away from the noisy crowd. It is nothing to worry your handsome head about. We were just chatting about the chilly evening air." Preston shifted his calculating eyes toward me, searching for any microscopic flaw in our impromptu alibi. I offered him a weak, incredibly fragile smile, blinking slowly, as if the ambient light was entirely overwhelming. "It is the absolute truth, Preston," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured exhaustion. I merely needed a quiet moment away from the overwhelming noise and the clinking glasses. The excitement of tomorrow is simply catching up with my fragile old heart. Thomas and Martha were incredibly gracious to assist a stumbling old fool like myself. I patted Thomas on the shoulder, feeling his muscles locked in absolute terror beneath his expensive suit jacket. Preston stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds. The heavy silence in the cramped coat room felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Slowly, the dangerous tension bled out of his posture. The charming, deeply concerned groom facade slid flawlessly back into place. He stepped forward and gently supported my elbow. "You must not overexert yourself, William," he murmured, his voice dripping with weaponized sympathy. "We need you healthy and perfectly strong to walk Audrey down the aisle." I nodded gratefully, allowing him to guide me out of the dimly lit coat room and back into the main corridor. As we walked slowly toward the private dining room, Preston leaned slightly closer to my ear. "Actually, William, I am incredibly glad I found you," he said smoothly. "I was just reviewing the updated meteorological reports with the event coordinator. It appears a rather severe, highly unpredictable storm system is moving rapidly across the lake, if we proceed with the original noon timeline. The outdoor ceremony will be entirely ruined by torrential rain and heavy winds. I cannot bear the thought of Audrey having her perfect day destroyed by terrible weather. Therefore, I made an executive decision to move the entire ceremony up by exactly 2 hours. We will commence at 10 o'clock in the morning instead. The catering staff and the floral team are completely notified." My blood ran completely cold. Julian Croft was a master manipulator. He had recognized an imperceptible shift in the atmosphere and was immediately accelerating his timeline to prevent any potential interference. The fabricated storm system was a brilliant, entirely plausible excuse to rush my scheduled execution. I kept my breathing shallow, masking the intense, burning adrenaline surging through my veins. 10 o'clock. I repeated slowly, feigning a profound sense of elderly confusion. "That is quite early, Preston. Will everyone be ready in time?" Preston patted my arm, projecting a sickeningly reassuring aura. "Do not worry about a single detail, William. I have everything completely under control. You just need to rest tonight and prepare yourself for tomorrow morning. I will ensure your morning coffee is delivered directly to your bedroom suite promptly at 8 o'clock, so you can relax before the festivities begin." The mention of the morning coffee sent a sharp, involuntary chill down my spine. That was the delivery mechanism for the lethal synthetic beta blockers. I offered him a remarkably grateful, deeply tired smile. "You truly think of absolutely everything, Preston. Audrey is incredibly fortunate to have such a decisive, capable man taking care of her. I will gladly follow your revised schedule. 10 o'clock it is. I promise I will be ready." Preston smiled, a flash of genuine triumphant arrogance illuminating his dark eyes. He firmly believed his lethal snare was tightening perfectly around my neck. He escorted me back into the lively dining room, guiding me to my seat at the head of the table with the gentle, deeply respectful care of a devoted son. I spent the remainder of the evening playing my designated role, smiling weakly at the toasts and nodding at the endless stream of meaningless conversations. I watched Julian Croft and Valerie Sterling exchange subtle, victorious glances across the candlelit table. They truly believed they had completely conquered the mighty William Vance. When the rehearsal dinner finally concluded, I was escorted back to my sprawling estate by my personal driver. The moment the heavy front doors locked behind me, I dropped the fragile patriarch persona entirely. My posture straightened and my mind sharpened into a lethal, incredibly focused weapon. The accelerated timeline meant I had significantly less room for error. I needed to ensure my private security detail was completely briefed and positioned to intercept Julian and Valerie the exact second Jonathan triggered the financial trap. I walked swiftly to my private study, retrieving my encrypted cellular phone. I dialed the direct, highly secure number for Marcus Thorne, my absolute best, most trusted head of security. Marcus was a former military operative who had managed my personal safety for over 15 years. I needed him to station his armed team around the perimeter of the guest suite. The phone rang 4 times before dropping directly to voicemail. I frowned, a deep knot forming in my stomach. Marcus never ignored a call from my private line. I dialed the secondary perimeter radio frequency. It echoed with static, followed by terrifying silence. The hair on my neck stood up. I moved swiftly toward the bay windows overlooking the rear gardens. I peered through the velvet curtains, scanning the moonlit grounds for my security patrols. The garden was completely still, cloaked in deep shadows. I grabbed a brass flashlight and quietly slipped out the side door, stepping onto the stone patio. I moved silently through the manicured hedges, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I rounded the corner near the large fountain and froze. Sprawled motionless across the grass was a large man in a dark tactical uniform. It was Marcus. I rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside him. His breathing was incredibly shallow, his pulse terribly weak. A precise puncture mark was visible on his neck. He had been neutralized with a highly concentrated chemical sedative. I stood up slowly, the chilling realization washing over me. The unmarked black utility vehicles I had seen earlier were not just waiting. Preston had unleashed his syndicate thugs onto my property. They had systematically dismantled my physical defense network. I was completely alone with the monsters. The sun rose over this eastern ridge of the estate, casting long beams of light across the manicured lawns. I stood perfectly still by the bay window of my private suite, watching the mist burn off the lake. The events of the previous night played repeatedly in my mind. Marcus was unconscious in the garden, a victim of a chemical sedative. The perimeter of my home had been entirely breached by ruthless syndicate operatives. I was physically cut off from the armed protection I had relied upon for over a decade. But I was not helpless. Jonathan Mitchell and his cyber team were securely positioned off-site, monitoring every digital heartbeat of my empire. The financial trap was fully armed, waiting for Julian Croft to take the bait. I turned away from the window and walked toward the heavy oak wardrobe. I pulled out a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, the garments feeling unnaturally heavy in my hands. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my only daughter's life. Instead, it was destined to become a battlefield. I dressed methodically, securing my gold cufflinks and adjusting the crisp collar of my shirt. I looked at my reflection in the tall mirror. I forced my shoulders to slump, practiced the slight tremor in my right hand, and allowed a look of profound fatigue to wash over my features. The performance had to be absolutely flawless. I stepped out into this quiet hallway and made my way toward the grand bridal suite, situated at the opposite end of the manor. The muffled sounds of frantic preparation echoed through the heavy doors. quiet laughter, the rustle of expensive silk. I knocked twice, leaning heavily upon my silver-handled cane. The door swung open to reveal Valerie Sterling, dressed in a stunning blue bridesmaid's gown. Her smile was remarkably bright, a perfect picture of supportive friendship masking the treacherous syndicate wife lurking beneath the surface. "Good morning, William," she chimed happily, stepping aside to grant me entry. "She is almost ready for you." I nodded weakly, shuffling past her and into the brightly illuminated sitting room. Audrey stood near the center of the room, surrounded by tall mirrors. My heart physically ached the moment I saw her. She was wearing a magnificent white gown of intricate lace and delicate pearls. Her dark hair was pinned up elegantly, catching the light. She turned to face me, her eyes shining with absolute joy. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "How do I look?" I moved toward her, slowly ignoring the watchful presence of Valerie lingering near the vanity. "You look absolutely breathtaking, sweetheart," I murmured, reaching out to gently touch the lace sleeve of her gown. "You look exactly like your mother did on our wedding day." Audrey smiled, a single tear escaping her eye and rolling down her flushed cheek. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms carefully around my shoulders, mindful of her pristine dress. I closed my eyes, holding my daughter incredibly tight. A crushing wave of sorrow threatened to break my carefully constructed facade. I knew exactly what was coming. I knew that within the next few hours, I was going to completely shatter her entire universe. I was going to systematically strip away the man she deeply loved, expose her best friend as a criminal operative, and plunge her perfect day into absolute chaos. I was doing it to save her life, to protect her from financial and emotional annihilation. But the pain I was about to inflict upon her was an agonizing burden to bear. I pulled back slightly, resting my trembling hands on her shoulders. I looked deeply into her bright, trusting eyes. "Audrey, I want you to remember something very important today." I said, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "No matter what happens in this life, no matter how dark or confusing things may briefly appear, I will always protect you. Everything I have ever done and everything I will ever do is to ensure you are safe. Do you understand me?" She offered a confused, gentle smile, playfully brushing a speck of dust from my lapel. "I know that, Dad. You have always been my protector. But you do not need to worry anymore. Preston is going to take care of me now." The sheer tragic irony of her absolute trust felt like a serrated knife twisting in my ribs. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy wooden door of the suite swung open once again. Preston strode confidently into the room, impeccably dressed in a sharp-tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was meticulously styled, and his handsome face radiated the victorious arrogance of a predator closing in for the final kill. "Ah, there is the beautiful bride," he declared smoothly, his voice filling the room with manufactured warmth. "And my esteemed future father-in-law." I thought this was the perfect moment for a private celebration before the chaotic ceremony begins downstairs. I noticed he was carrying a polished silver tray, balancing 3 delicate crystal flutes of champagne. Valerie stepped forward instantly, clapping her hands together in feigned delight. "Oh, Preston, what a wonderful, thoughtful idea. We definitely need a toast to calm the morning nerves." Preston smiled, offering the first crystal flute to Audrey. He handed the second glass to Valerie, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second in a silent, conspiratorial exchange. Then he turned his predatory focus entirely upon me. He lifted the final crystal flute from the silver tray and extended it gracefully toward me. As the glass caught the bright morning sunlight streaming through the windows, I noticed a very slight, almost imperceptible difference. The effervescent liquid inside this specific flute was distinctly darker than the champagne in Audrey and Valerie's glasses. It possessed a very faint, cloudy amber hue near the bottom of the delicate stem. This was it. This was the lethal synthetic beta blocker Jonathan had repeatedly warned me about. The chemical agent expertly designed to induce a massive, untraceable cardiac event and end my life before the wedding march even began. Preston stepped closer, his dark eyes locking firmly onto mine. "For you, William," he murmured, his voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register meant only for my ears. "A special vintage to celebrate the incredible legacy you are leaving behind and the wonderful future you have so generously provided for us." I reached out with a violently trembling hand, playing the frail, unsuspecting victim one final time. My fingers wrapped around the delicate crystal stem, the cold glass pressed against my skin. I looked at Audrey, who was beaming brightly, raising her glass in joyful anticipation. I looked at Valerie, watching me with the detached interest of a seasoned assassin, verifying a target. Finally, I turned my gaze back to Julian Croft. The man who orchestrated the complete destruction of my empire stood perfectly still. I slowly straightened my back, letting the tremor vanish entirely. I offered Preston a calm, unsettling smile. I raised the poisoned flute toward my lips. Preston leaned forward slightly, his calculating eyes gleaming with absolute sadistic anticipation. I brought the crystal rim to my mouth, allowing the cold glass to rest against my lower lip. I tilted my head back, closing my eyes to feign a deep swallow, keeping my throat sealed. The toxic liquid pooled dangerously against my teeth, bitter and sharply metallic. I held the liquid there, lowering the glass with a manufactured exhale of satisfaction. To a long and prosperous future, I rasped, forcing a watery smile. Preston nodded, his chest puffing out with victorious pride as he and Audrey drank deeply from their untainted glasses. Suddenly, a frantic wedding coordinator burst into the bridal suite, her headset buzzing with static. She informed Valerie of a floral crisis. The distraction was absolute perfection. As Audrey and Preston turned their heads toward the panicked coordinator, I stepped backward toward the heavy velvet curtains framing the bay window. Hidden entirely by the folds of fabric, I leaned over a massive potted fern. I parted my lips and quietly expelled the poisoned champagne into the dark soil, followed by the remaining contents of my flute. I wiped my mouth with a linen handkerchief. By the time Preston turned back to face me, my glass was completely empty. He looked at the flute, his dark eyes flashing with terrifying satisfaction. The timer on my life had officially begun ticking in his mind. The machinery of the grand wedding shifted into high gear, sweeping us out of the bridal suite toward the waiting armored limousines. We arrived at the historic cathedral downtown as heavy storm clouds began to gather over the city skyline, validating Preston's fabricated weather concerns. The massive stone architecture loomed overhead, casting dark shadows across the marble steps. The air was thick with the scent of rain and blooming white roses. I stood in the private holding chamber near the heavy entrance doors, my heart beating with a slow, measured rhythm. The time for hesitation had completely evaporated. I was standing at the absolute precipice of a monumental collision. The faint strains of the grand pipe organ began to vibrate through the ancient stone floors. The sanctuary beyond those doors was packed with Chicago's wealthiest elite. Corporate titans, politicians, and generational socialites filled the polished wooden pews. They had all gathered to witness the majestic union of two powerful dynasties. They sat there in their tailored suits and custom gowns, whispering politely among themselves, completely oblivious to the fact that they were sitting directly on top of a massive powder keg. They believed they were attending a celebration of pure love. They had no idea they were about to witness the destruction of an international criminal syndicate. Audrey stepped up beside me, slipping her delicate arm gently through mine. Her fingers trembled slightly against my dark tuxedo jacket. She looked up at me, her veil casting a soft glow over her beautiful face. "Are you ready, Dad?" she whispered, her voice laced with nervous excitement. I placed my free hand over hers, giving a firm, grounding squeeze. "I am completely ready, my darling," I replied, and it was the truest statement I had uttered in weeks. The heavy wooden doors slowly swung open, revealing the breathtaking expanse of the cathedral sanctuary. The white floral arrangements created a fragrant tunnel leading to the elevated altar. The pipe organ swelled into the traditional bridal chorus, the rich chords echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The congregation rose to their feet in perfect unison, a sea of expectant faces turning toward the entrance. I stepped forward, guiding my daughter down the long, red-carpeted aisle. I kept my movements intentionally slow, leaning heavily upon my silver-handled cane. I played the role of a failing patriarch, merely holding on to his last thread of life to see his child married. But inside my mind, the tactical calculations were firing with lethal precision. I analyzed the placement of the exit doors. I noted the locations of the security personnel. I mentally reviewed the precise timeline Jonathan Mitchell was executing in his dark command center. The offshore accounts were frozen. The corporate debt was permanently anchored to Julian Croft's identity. The trap was sprung, and the jaws were rapidly closing. Navigating the central aisle, my gaze locked onto the man waiting at the end of our path. Preston stood upon the elevated marble altar flanked by his groomsmen and the terrified parents I had confronted the night before. Thomas and Martha stood perfectly rigid in the front pew, their faces pale and slick with anxious sweat, refusing to make eye contact. Preston was a portrait of absolute, chilling composure. He watched us approach with an expression of deep, reverent love, playing the perfect groom for the hundreds of witnesses. But as we drew closer, I saw the true monster lurking beneath the meticulously tailored tuxedo. I saw the cold, calculating syndicate operative who fully believed I was dying from a fatal dose of synthetic poison. I saw the man who planned to steal my fortune and frame my innocent daughter. We reached the base of the marble steps. The pipe organ music faded into a reverent, expectant silence. I turned to Audrey, lifting her delicate veil and kissing her softly on the cheek. "I love you," I whispered, ensuring she heard the absolute conviction in my voice. I stepped back, presenting her to the waiting groom. Preston stepped down, taking her hand in his. As he did, his dark, predatory eyes met mine. He offered a remarkably subtle, almost imperceptible nod of triumph, silently mocking my perceived weakness. He genuinely believed he had won the ultimate victory. I did not break our eye contact. I stood completely upright, letting the facade of the trembling old man slip away for one fleeting, terrifying second. I stared directly into the black void of his soul, my eyes broadcasting a silent, unmistakable promise of total annihilation. A microscopic flash of confusion registered across Preston's handsome face. He blinked, clearly unsettled by the intense clarity radiating from my gaze. Before he could analyze my demeanor, I smoothly stepped back and took my designated seat in the front pew, directly beside the heavily perspiring Thomas and Martha. I folded my hands calmly over the silver handle of my cane, my posture returning to a quiet, dignified observation. Preston turned back to Audrey forcefully, burying his sudden unease beneath a charming, practiced smile. The elderly priest, clad in flowing white vestments, stepped forward to the heavy wooden podium. He raised his hands, officially welcoming the gathered elite of Chicago to the sacred ceremony. He spoke eloquently about the profound virtues of trust, the enduring power of honesty, and the sacred bonds of marital devotion. Every single word he uttered felt steeped in a thick layer of tragic irony. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic cadence of the ceremony, waiting for the precise, inevitable moment. The priest turned a page in his thick leather-bound book, looking out over the silent congregation. "We are gathered here today to unite this man and this woman in holy matrimony." His voice boomed, carrying across the vast cathedral. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." The heavy silence that followed the ancient invocation hung in the cathedral air like a suspended breath. Hundreds of Chicago elite sat perfectly still in the polished wooden pews, waiting for the brief traditional pause to pass so the ceremony could proceed. Preston maintained his handsome, reverent smile, his eyes fixed on Audrey. I sat in the front row, feeling the heavy silver handle of my cane resting beneath my palms. This was the exact moment, the absolute precipice. I unclasped my hands. I let the heavy silver-handled cane slide from my grip. It struck the ancient stone floor of the cathedral with a sharp, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent sanctuary. The sudden noise caused the entire congregation to jump. Preston snapped his head toward me, a flash of genuine irritation breaking through his carefully constructed facade. Thomas and Martha, sitting frozen beside me, shrank back into the oak pew. I did not bend down to retrieve the cane. I did not hunch my shoulders or feign the trembling weakness of a dying man. Instead, I placed my hands flat upon the wooden pew in front of me and pushed myself upward. I stood perfectly upright, expanding my chest, extending my spine to its full commanding height. The manufactured frailty vanished instantly, replaced by the imposing, ruthless presence of a man who had built a global empire from nothing. I looked directly past the bewildered priest, locking my eyes onto the monster standing upon the marble altar. "I object," I stated, my voice echoing with booming absolute authority. A collective gasp rippled through the packed cathedral. Whispers erupted among the wealthy politicians and corporate titans seated behind me. Audrey turned her head, her beautiful face painted with utter confusion and deep concern. "Dad, what are you doing?" she whispered frantically, taking a hesitant step toward the edge of the altar. "You need to sit down. You are not well." Preston quickly moved to her side, wrapping a protective arm around her waist, playing the role of the deeply concerned groom to absolute perfection. "William, please," Preston said smoothly, his voice projecting calm reassurance to the hundreds of watching guests. "We know you have been struggling with your health and your memory. This is a highly emotional day. Let the ushers help you back to your seat so we can finish the ceremony." I ignored his sickening performance entirely. I raised my right hand, snapping my fingers with a sharp, echoing crack. That was the designated signal. At the back of the massive sanctuary, the heavy oak entrance doors suddenly slammed shut with a deafening thud. The metallic clack of heavy deadbolts locking into place echoed through the cavernous space. Jonathan Mitchell had positioned his private military contractors flawlessly. Men who had previously appeared to be simple ushers and catering staff suddenly stepped out of the shadows, their postures rigid and their hands resting near their suit jackets. They secured every single exit point in the building, effectively sealing the entire congregation inside. No one was leaving. The murmurs among the elite guests rapidly escalated into murmurs of genuine alarm. Preston stiffened his dark eyes, darting toward the locked doors and the stationed contractors. The charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second as his highly trained predatory instincts registered the sudden shift in the environment. He realized he was no longer in control. "What is the meaning of this?" William Preston demanded, his voice dropping its warm cadence and adopting a sharper, commanding edge. "You are frightening Audrey and ruining her wedding. Open those doors immediately." I did not respond to his hollow demands. I kept my gaze fixed upon him as I delivered the next phase of the counterattack. "Jonathan." I called out, my voice resonating through the silent church. "Execute the broadcast." Instantly, the massive cathedral darkened as automated blackout shades descended over the towering stained glass windows. Before the panicked guests could even react to the sudden darkness, 4 massive, high-definition motorized projector screens dropped swiftly from the vaulted ceilings, positioning themselves directly behind the altar and along the stone walls. The upgraded audio system, which Jonathan had secretly hijacked during the night, hummed to life with a low, powerful vibration. The screens flickered, blazing with bright, undeniable clarity. The first piece of hidden camera footage began to play at a deafening volume, projecting the dark, moonlit hallway of my estate. The entire congregation stared in absolute shock as the massive screens displayed Preston and Valerie emerging from the guest suite shadows. The hidden microphone captured the unmistakable sound of their passionate, desperate kiss. A wave of horrified gasps washed over the pews. Audrey stumbled backward on the marble altar, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the 50-foot projection of her loving groom kissing her supportive best friend. Valerie, standing near the bridesmaids, let out a sharp, terrified shriek, her face draining of all color. Before anyone could process the first revelation, the screens seamlessly transitioned to the second intercepted clip. It was the footage from my private study. The audio blared through the cathedral speakers, capturing Preston's chilling, malevolent whisper as he leaned over my seemingly unconscious body. "Do not worry, old man. I will take exceptionally good care of your precious little girl once you are in the ground." The sheer, unadulterated evil in his projected voice sent a physical shudder through the hundreds of seated guests. Audrey let out a broken, agonizing sob, tearing herself completely away from Preston's grasp. The man she loved was a complete fabrication, a lethal phantom sent to destroy her life. But the psychological execution was not finished. The screens shifted one final time, broadcasting the audio recording I had secured in the coat room during the rehearsal dinner. The frantic, terrified voices of Thomas and Martha echoed through the grand sanctuary. Their panicked confessions filled the room, detailing the $50 million embezzlement scheme, the offshore criminal syndicate, and the lethal synthetic beta blockers Preston had intended to put into my morning coffee. The absolute truth crashed down upon the altar, shattering the meticulous illusion Julian Croft had spent months building. Audrey retreated until her back hit the marble railing, her white gown trembling as she wept in unadulterated horror. She finally saw the monster hiding behind the handsome face. The high society crowd was in total uproar, shouting in confusion and profound terror as the private military contractors held the perimeter. Preston stood frozen at the center of the altar, his dark eyes darting frantically around the locked, guarded cathedral. He had walked into an inescapable snare. The sophisticated facade abruptly shattered, his expression contorted into a mask of pure, very feral rage. Realizing his massive con had completely failed and that he was entirely trapped within the stone walls, Julian Croft dropped the gentlemanly act. He reached swiftly beneath his tailored tuxedo jacket. In one fluid, terrifyingly fast motion, he pulled a matte black concealed weapon from his shoulder holster. The congregation screamed as he leveled the lethal firearm, his eyes burning with sadistic desperation. With nowhere left to run, Julian lunged directly toward Audrey. The dull black metal of the firearm caught the colorful light as Julian Croft aimed directly at Audrey. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. The high society congregation erupted into pure, unadulterated panic. Screams of terror bounced off the arches. Wealthy politicians and executives scrambled over the pews, diving frantically for cover. But I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Before Julian could even fully extend his arm, the sanctuary exploded into orchestrated violence. The private military contractors stationed at the exits moved with lethal speed. But they were not the only ones waiting in the shadows. 4 men and 2 women, previously disguised as elegant wedding guests, surged forward. They were undercover federal agents, and they descended upon the altar like a synchronized tidal wave. Julian barely managed a single panicked breath before a massive agent tackled him around the waist. The impact sent them crashing brutally against the polished marble steps. The heavy firearm clattered uselessly across the stone floor. 3 more agents immediately piled onto Julian, pinning his limbs to the cold ground with absolute, unforgiving force. He thrashed violently, snarling and spitting like a trapped feral animal, his handsome tuxedo tearing at the seams. Beside the altar, Valerie Sterling realized the elaborate game was entirely over. She dropped her delicate bridal bouquet and spun around, lifting the hem of her expensive bridesmaid gown, desperately sprinting toward the side exit leading to the sacristy. She did not make it past the choir loft. 2 female federal agents intercepted her, driving her firmly against the heavy wooden paneling of the wall. Valerie shrieked in absolute fury, kicking and scratching, but the agents efficiently twisted her arms behind her back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply above the chaotic din of the panicked crowd. The ruthless syndicate wife was finally neutralized. I stood perfectly still amidst the deafening chaos, watching the scene unfold with deep, profound satisfaction. The majestic cathedral, adorned with imported white roses and burning candles, had transformed into a glorious stage of justice. I slowly walked forward, gripping my silver-handled cane, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The screaming congregation began to realize that the immediate threat was neutralized. The frantic scrambling slowly subsided into a stunned, breathless silence broken only by the muffled sobs of the terrified guests and the violent struggling of the pinned criminals. I stepped onto the elevated altar, walking past my weeping daughter, who was safely shielded by two heavily armed contractors. I did not stop to comfort her yet. The final blow needed to be delivered directly to the monster who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. Julian Croft was shoved forcefully onto his knees by the federal agents, his arms secured tightly behind his back with thick metal cuffs. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. His face was bruised and smeared with dust from the cathedral floor. He glared up at me, his chest heaving with exertion, his dark eyes burning with unadulterated, venomous hatred. "You think you have won, William," he spat, blood staining his white teeth. "You think sending me to a federal penitentiary changes anything? I still breached your walls. I still broke your daughter. You are just a fragile, dying old man holding on to an empire you cannot protect." I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of any emotion. I did not display anger. I did not display triumph. I offered him nothing but absolute chilling emptiness. "You are significantly less intelligent than you believe yourself to be, Julian," I stated, my voice echoing with quiet, deadly authority. "You spent 8 months meticulously studying my family. You analyzed my financial portfolios. You infiltrated my home. Yet you failed to understand the most fundamental aspect of my existence. I am not a victim. I am the architect of your complete destruction." Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh, struggling uselessly against the heavy grip of the federal agents. "You have nothing, William. My offshore accounts are completely untraceable. Even if I spend 20 years rotting in a federal cell, I will walk out a remarkably wealthy man. Your precious $50 million trust is already gone." I smiled, then a slow, incredibly dark smile that caused the arrogant defiance to instantly evaporate from his bruised face. "You truly believe you stole $50 million from my estate this morning?" I asked softly, stepping closer until the polished tip of my cane rested inches from his knee. "Let me clarify the actual situation for you. The private trust fund you accessed at exactly 8 o'clock today was not a repository for my vast wealth. It was a highly sophisticated, digitally engineered trap built by my cybersecurity team. You did not drain my accounts, Julian. You triggered a massive automated corporate debt transfer." His dark eyes widened in sudden, profound panic. The breath caught visibly in his throat. "What are you talking about?" He stammered, the smooth, confident criminal facade finally fracturing into a million irreparable pieces. I leaned down slightly, ensuring every single word pierced directly into his black heart. "The digital protocols you authorized this morning completely bypassed my personal capital," I explained smoothly. "Instead, the trust you thought you successfully stole actually transferred $15 million of extremely toxic defaulted corporate debt directly into your verified identity. My team bypassed your offshore firewalls while your attention was focused on poisoning my morning coffee. We anchored the massive financial liability entirely to your real name, your hidden accounts, and your syndicate network. The international authorities have already frozen whatever pathetic assets you previously held to cover the outstanding damages." The truth crashed down upon him with the devastating force of a physical blow. His jaw went completely slack. The color vanished rapidly from his bruised face, leaving a sickly, terrified pallor in its wake. "You are not just going to a federal prison for a very long time, Preston," I whispered, using his fabricated name one last time as a final mocking insult. "You are going there absolutely, completely bankrupt. You possess nothing. You are nothing." A guttural, agonizing scream erupted from the depths of his chest. It was the desperate, horrific wail of a predator, realizing he had been completely outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and totally destroyed. He thrashed with renewed, frenzied violence, attempting to kick at my legs, but the federal agents held him firmly in place. "Get him out of my cathedral," I commanded coldly. turning my back on the pathetic creature without a second glance. The agents hauled the screaming, broken man to his feet, dragging him forcefully down the long, red-carpeted aisle. Through the heavy oak doors, the distant rising wail of police sirens began to echo across the storm-swept city streets, signaling the arrival of the local authorities to process the massive syndicate bust. The treacherous reign of Julian Croft was completely and permanently terminated. I stood alone near the marble altar, breathing in the scent of rain and white roses. Slowly, I turned to face my completely shattered daughter amidst the silent, ruined cathedral. Audrey was trembling violently, her beautiful white gown pooled around her on the cold marble floor like a fallen cloud. I walked over to her, dropping my heavy silver cane, and knelt beside her. I wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders, pulling her against my chest. She buried her face into my tuxedo, weeping with a profound, agonizing sorrow that tore at my heart. I held her firmly, whispering that she was safe, that it was finally over, and that I would never let anyone hurt her again. The grand echoing space of the cathedral felt entirely different now. The toxic illusion had been eradicated, leaving only the painful, absolute truth in its wake. The sounds of police sirens faded into the distance, carrying away the monsters who had tried to destroy us. Our family was deeply fractured, but we were absolutely alive. We had fought back against the darkness and emerged completely victorious, ready to face the long, arduous journey of emotional recovery that lay directly ahead. 6 months have passed since that terrifying morning. The chaotic dust of the shattered wedding has finally settled, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of healing. The federal authorities moved swiftly and mercilessly. The mountain of digital and physical evidence Jonathan Mitchell compiled was absolutely impenetrable. Julian Croft, the man who called himself Preston, along with his accomplice Valerie Sterling, were both convicted of federal wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and attempted murder. They are currently serving 25-year sentences in maximum security penitentiaries, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and their fabricated identities. Thomas and Martha accepted a plea deal, trading their comprehensive testimony for reduced sentences in a minimum security federal facility. The international syndicate that backed them was dismantled, their offshore accounts permanently frozen by international banking regulators. The entire criminal network was reduced to absolute ashes. The justice we secured was absolute and completely unforgiving. The road to recovery for Audrey was incredibly difficult. The psychological trauma of discovering that her entire relationship was a calculated, lethal con game nearly broke her spirit. There were days of intense burning anger and nights of profound, unending grief. But my daughter is remarkably resilient. She entered intensive therapy, dedicating herself to unpacking the manipulation and rebuilding her shattered confidence. Slowly, the bright, joyful light returned to her eyes. She moved back into the family estate, filling the empty halls with genuine warmth once more. More importantly, she decided she no longer wanted to remain sheltered from the harsh realities of my world. She asked to join the corporate firm, eager to understand the complex machinery of the empire I had built. She now works directly alongside me, reviewing dense portfolios, analyzing financial risk, and learning the true value of the family business. She is fierce, intelligent, and fiercely protective of our legacy. She will never be manipulated by anyone ever again. She found her true power in the devastating aftermath of her greatest heartbreak. I am standing by the large bay window of my executive office, watching the busy downtown streets far below. A steaming cup of black coffee rests in my hand, rich, dark, and completely untainted. I take a slow, deeply satisfying sip, finding immense peace in the quiet silence I fought so incredibly hard to protect. Through the clear glass partition of my private office, I can see Audrey sitting at the large mahogany conference table. She is laughing genuinely at a quick joke Jonathan Mitchell just made, her posture radiating a quiet, unshakable strength. The heavy, suffocating burden I carried for those agonizing months has entirely vanished. We survived the terrible storm, emerging stronger, closer, and infinitely wiser. We are finally safe and truly secure forever. I look at my daughter, knowing that the legacy I leave behind will be guarded by someone who truly understands the lethal cost of blind trust. I spent my entire adult life building an empire, mistakenly believing that financial security was the ultimate shield for my family. But wealth without vigilance is just bait for predators. The greatest lesson I learned at 70 years old is that true protection requires confronting the ugly truths we desperately want to ignore. You cannot buy loyalty, and you certainly cannot negotiate with deceit. Never dismiss your intuition as paranoia. If a situation feels wrong, it probably is. Sometimes the most profound act of love a father can perform is tearing down a beautiful lie to rebuild a painful but unshakable truth. If this story opened your eyes today, hit that like button below to support this channel. Subscribe now so you never miss another high-stakes life lesson. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and how you would have handled this betrayal. See you all next time.